The Purple Catholic Literature Collection presents Death Comes for the Archbishop by Willa Cather, narrated and presented by Matthew Handley.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the program. I'm Matthew Handley in Ishpeming, Michigan. This is episode 4 of Death Comes for the Archbishop, presented by the Purple Catholic Literature Collection. In our reading today, Bishop Latour will travel to the more rural areas of his diocese. He'll visit Padre Gallegos in Isleta, which is just south of Albuquerque, and journey with his native guide Jacinto to Laguna, now the Laguna Pueblo, a federally recognized tribe. Later in the program, Dr. John Pinheiro from the Acton Institute will join me to discuss the Mexican-American War and public attitudes towards Catholics in 19th century America. But first, death comes for the Archbishop.
Book 3, The Mass at Acoma. Chapter 1, The Wooden Parrot.
During the first year after his arrival in Santa Fe, the bishop was actually in his diocese only for about 4 months. 6 months of that year were consumed in attending the plenary council at Baltimore, to which he had been summoned. He went on horseback over the Santa Fe Trail to St. Louis, nearly 1,000 miles, then by steamboat to Pittsburgh, across the mountains to Cumberland, and on to Washington by the new railroad. The return journey was even slower, as he had with him 5 nuns who came to found the School of Our Lady of Light. He reached Santa Fe late in September. So far, Bishop Latour had been mainly employed on business that took him away from his vicariate. His great diocese was still an unimaginable mystery to him. He was eager to be abroad in it, to know his people, to escape for a little while from the causes of building and founding, and to go westward among the old isolated Indian missions, Santo Domingo, breeder of horses, Isleta, whitened with gypsum, Laguna with wide pastures, and finally, cloud-set Acoma. In the golden October weather, the bishop, with his blankets and coffee pot, attended by Jacinto, a young Indian from the Pescos Pueblo, whom he had employed as a guide, set off to visit the Indian missions in the west. He spent a night and a day at Albuquerque with the genial and popular Padre Gallegos. After Santa Fe, Albuquerque was the most important parish in the diocese. The priest belonged to an influential Mexican family, and he and the rancheros had run their church to suit themselves, making a very gay affair of it. Though Padre Gallegos was 10 years older than the bishop, he would still dance the fandango 5 nights running, as if he could never have enough of it. He had many friends in the American colony with whom he played poker and went hunting when he was not dancing with the Mexicans. His cellar was well stacked with wines from El Paso del Norte, whiskey from Taos, and great brandy from Bernalillo. He was genuinely hospitable, and the gambler down on his luck, the soldier sobering up, were always welcome at his table. The padre was adored by a rich Mexican widow who was hostess at his supper parties, engaged his servants for him, made lace for the altar and napery for his table. Every Sunday her carriage, the only closed one in Albuquerque, waited in the plaza after Mass, and when the priest had put off his vestments, he came out and was driven away to the ladies' hacienda for dinner. The bishop and Father Vaillant had thoroughly examined the case of Father Gallegos and meant to end this scandalous state of things well before Christmas. But on his visit, Father Latour exhibited neither astonishment nor displeasure at anything, and Padre Gallegos was cordial and most ceremoniously polite. When the bishop permitted him to express some surprise that there was not a confirmation class awaiting him, the padre explained smoothly that it was his custom to confirm infants at their baptism. "It is all the same in a Christian community like ours. We know they will receive religious instruction as they grow up, so we make good Catholics out of them in the beginning. Why not?" The padre was uneasy lest the bishop should require his attendance on a trip out among the missions. He had no liking for scanty food and a bed on the rocks. So, though he had been dancing only a few nights before, he received his superior with one foot bandaged up in an Indian moccasin and complained of a severe attack of gout. Asked when he had last celebrated Mass at Acoma, he made no direct reply. It used to be his custom, he said, to go there in Passion Week, but the Acoma Indians were unreclaimed heathen at heart and had no wish to be bothered with the Mass. The last time he went out there, he was unable to get into the church at all. The Indians pretended they had not the key, that the governor had it, and that he had gone on Indian business up into the Cebolleta Mountains. The bishop did not wish Padre Gallego's company on his journey and was very glad not to have the embarrassment of refusing it, and he rode away from Albuquerque after polite farewells. Yet he reflected there was something very engaging about Gallegos as a man. As a priest he was impossible. He was too self-satisfied and popular ever to change his ways, and he certainly could not change his face. He did not look quite like a professional gambler, but something smooth and twinkling in his countenance suggested an underhanded mode of life. There was but one course: to suspend the man from the exercise of all priestly functions, and bid the smaller native priests take warning. Father Vaillant had told the bishop that he must by all means stop a night at Isleta, as he would like the priest there, Padre Jesus de Baca, an old white-haired man, almost blind, who had been at Isleta many years and had won the confidence and affection of his Indians. When he approached the pueblo of Isleta, gleaming white across a low plain of gray sand, Father Latour's spirits rose. It was beautiful, that warm, rich whiteness of the church, and the clustered town, shaded by a few bright acacia trees, with their intense blue-green-like color of old paper window blinds. That tree always awakened pleasant memories, recalling a garden in the south of France where he used to visit his young cousins. As he rode up to the church, the old priest came out to meet him, and after his salutation stood looking at Father Latour, shading his failing eyes with his hand. "And can this be my bishop, so young a man?" he exclaimed. They went into the priest's house by way of a garden, walled in behind the church. The enclosure was full of domesticated cactus plants, of many varieties and great size. It seemed the padre loved them, and among these hung wicker cages made full of twigs, full of parrots. There were even parrots hopping about the sanded paths, with one wing clipped to keep them at home. Father Jesus explained that parrot feathers were much prized by his Indians as ornaments for their ceremonial robes, and he had long ago found he could please his parishioners by raising the birds. The priest's house was white within and without, like all the Isleta houses, and was almost as bare as an Indian dwelling. The old man was poor, and too soft-hearted to press the Pueblo people for pesos. An Indian girl cooked his beans and cornmeal mush for him. He required little else. The girl was not very skillful, he said, but she was clean about her cooking. When the bishop remarked that everything in this pueblo, even the streets, seemed clean, the padre told him that near Isleta there was a hill of some white material which the Indians ground up and used as whitewash. They had done this from time immemorial, and the village had always been noted for its whiteness. A little talk with Father Jesus revealed that he was simple almost to childishness and very superstitious. But there was a good quality of golden goodness about him. His right eye was overgrown by a cataract, and he kept his head tilted as if he were trying to see around it. All his movements were to the left, as if he were reaching or walking around some obstacle in his path. After coming to the house by way of a garden full of parrots, Father Latour was amused to find that the sole ornament in the padre's poor, bare little sala was a wooden parrot perched in a hoop and hung from one of the roof logs. While Father Jesus was instructing his Indian girl in the kitchen, the bishop took this carving down from its perch to examine it. It was cut from a single stick of wood, exactly the size of a living bird, body and tail rigid and straight, the head a little turned. The wings and tail and neck feathers were just indicated by the tool and thinly painted. He was surprised to feel how light it was. The surface had the whiteness and velvety smoothness of very old wood. Though scarcely carved at all, merely smoothed in the shape, it was strangely lifelike, a wooden pattern of parrots, as it were. The padre smiled when he found the bishop with the bird in his hand. "I see you have found my treasure. That, your grace, is probably the oldest thing in the pueblo, older than the pueblo itself." The parrot, Father Jesus said, had always been the bird of wonder and desire to the Pueblo Indians. In ancient times, its feathers were more valued than wampum and turquoises. Even before the Spaniards came, the pueblos of northern New Mexico used to send explorers along the dangerous and difficult trade routes down into tropical Mexico to bring back upon their bodies a cargo of parrot feathers. To purchase these, the trader carried pouches full of turquoise from the Cerrillos Hills near Santa Fe. When, very rarely, a trader succeeded in bringing back a live bird to his people, it was paid divine honors, and its death threw the whole village into the deepest gloom. Even the bones were piously preserved. There was in Isleta a parrot skull of great antiquity. His wooden bird he had bought from an old man who was much indebted to him, and who was about to die without descendants. Father Jesus had his eye upon the bird for years. The Indian told him that his ancestors, generations ago, had brought it with them from the mother pueblo. The priest fondly believed that it was a portrait, done from life, of one of those rare birds that in ancient times were carried up alive, all the long trail from the tropics. Father Jesus gave a good report of the Indians at Laguna and Acoma. He used to go to those pueblos to hold services when he was younger, and had always found them friendly. "At Acoma," he said, "you can see something very holy. They have a portrait there of St. Joseph, sent to them by one of the kings of Spain long ago, and it has worked many miracles. If the season is dry, the Acoma people take the picture down to their farms at Acomita, and it never fails to produce rain. They have rain when none falls in the country, and all the crops when the Laguna Indians have none."
Chapter 2, Jacinto.
Taking leave of Isleta and its priest early in the morning, Father Latour and his guide rode all day through the dry desert plain west of Albuquerque. It was like a country of dry ashes. No juniper, no rabbit brush, nothing but thickets of withered, dead-looking cactus and patches of wild pumpkin, the only vegetation that had any vitality. It is a vine remarkable for its tendency not to spread and ramble, but to mass and mount. Its long, sharp-arrowed leaves, frosted over with prickly silver, are thrust upward and crowded together. The whole rigid, upthrust matted clump looks less like a plant than that of a great colony of gray-green lizards, moving and suddenly arrested by fear. As the morning wore on, they had to make their way through a sandstorm which quite obscured the sun. Jacinto knew the country well, having crossed it often to go to the religious dances at Laguna, but he rode with his head low and a purple handkerchief tied over his mouth. Coming from a pueblo among the woods and water, he had a poor opinion of this plain. At noon he alighted and collected enough greasewood to boil the bishop's coffee. They knelt on either side of the fire, the sand curling about them, so that the bread became gritty as they ate it. The sun set red in an atmosphere murky with sand. The travelers made a dry camp and rolled themselves in their blankets. All night a cold wind blew over them. Father Latour was so stiff that he arose long before daybreak. The dawn came at last, fair and clear, and they made an early start. About the middle of that afternoon, Jacinto pointed out Laguna in the distance, lying apparently in the midst of bright yellow waves of high sand dunes, yellow as ochre. As they approached, Father Latour found these were petrified sand dunes, long waves of soft, gritty yellow rock, shining and bare except for a few lines of dark juniper that grew out of the weathered cracks, little trees and very, very old. At the foot of this sweep of rock waves was the Blue Lake, a stone basin full of water from which the pueblo took its name. The kindly padre at Isleta had sent his cook's brother off on foot to warn the Laguna people that the new high priest was coming, and that he was a good man and did not want money. They were prepared accordingly. The church was clean and the doors were open. A small white church, painted above and about the altar with gods of wind and rain and thunder, sun and moon, linked together in a geometrical design of crimson and blue and dark green, so that the ends of the church seemed to be hung with tapestry. It recalled to Father Latour the interior of a Persian chieftain's tent he had seen in a textile exhibit at Lyon. Whether this decoration had been done by Spanish missionaries or by Indian converts, he was unable to find out. The governor told him that his people would come to Mass in the morning, and that there were a number of children to be baptized. He offered the bishop the sacristy for the night, but there was a damp, earthly smell about that chamber, and Father Latour had already made up his mind that he would like to sleep on the rock dunes under the junipers. Jacinto got firewood and good water from the lagunas, and they made their camp in a pleasant spot on the rocks north of the village. As the sun dropped low, the light brought the white church and the yellow adobe houses up into relief from the flat ledges. Behind their camp, not far away, lay a group of great mesas. The bishops asked Jacinto if he knew the name of one of the nearest. "No, I do not know any name," he shook his head. "I know Indian name," he added, as if for once he were thinking out loud. "And what is the Indian name?" "The Laguna Indians call Snowbird Mountain." He spoke somewhat unwillingly. "That is very nice," said the bishop musingly. "Yes, that is a pretty name." "Oh, the Indians have nice names too," Jacinto replied quickly with a curl of the lip. Then, as if he felt he had taken out on the bishop a reproach he had not deserved, he said in a moment, "The Laguna people think it very funny for a big priest to be a young man. The governor say, how can I call him padre when he is younger than my sons?" There was a note of pride in Jacinto's voice, very flattering to the bishop. He noticed how kind the Indian voice could be when it was kind at all. A slight inflection made one feel that he had received a great compliment. "I'm not very young in heart, Jacinto. How old are you, my boy?" 26. "Have you a son?" "One, baby, not very long born." Jacinto usually dropped the article in speaking Spanish just as he did in speaking English, though the bishop had noticed that when he did give a noun its article, he used the right one. The customary omission, therefore, seemed to be a matter of taste, not ignorance. In the Indian conception of language, such attachments were superfluous and unpleasing, perhaps. They relapsed into the silence which was their usual form of intercourse. The bishop sat drinking his coffee slowly out of the tin cup, keeping the pot near the embers. The sun had set now. The yellow rocks were turning gray. Down in the pueblo, the light of the cook fires made red patches of the glassless windows, and the smell of pinon smoke came softly through the still air. The whole western sky was the color of golden ashes, with here and there a flush of red on the lip of a little cloud. High above the horizon, the evening star flickered like a lamp just lit, and close beside it was another star of constant light, much smaller. Jacinto threw away the end of his cornhusk cigarette and again smoked without being addressed. "The evening star," he said in English, slowly and somewhat sententiously, then relapsed into Spanish. "You see the little star beside, Padre? Indians call him the guide." The two companions sat, each thinking his own thoughts as night closed in about them, a blue night set with stars, the bulk of the solitary mesas cutting into the firmament. The bishop seldom questioned Jacinto about his thoughts or beliefs. He didn't think it polite, and he believed it to be useless. There was no way in which he could transfer his own memories of European civilization into the Indian mind, and he was quite willing to believe that behind Jacinto there was a long tradition, a story of experience which no language could translate to him. A chill came with the darkness. Father Latour put on his old fur-lined cloak, and Jacinto, loosening the blankets tied about his loins, drew it up over his head and shoulders. "Many stars," he said presently. "What you think about the stars, Padre?" "The wise men tells us they are worlds like ours, Jacinto." The end of the Indian cigarette grew bright and then dull again before he spoke. "I think not," he said in the tone of one who has considered a proposition fairly and rejected it. "I think they were the leaders, great spirits." "Perhaps they are," said the bishop with a sigh. "Whatever they are great. Let us say our Father and go to sleep, my boy." Kneeling on either side of the embers, they repeated the prayer together and then rolled up their blankets. The bishop went to sleep thinking with the satisfaction that he was beginning some sort of human companionship with his Indian boy. One called the young Indians boys, perhaps because there was something youthful and elastic in their bodies. Certainly about their behavior there was nothing boyish in the American sense, nor even in the European sense. Jacinto was never, by any chance, naive. He was never taken by surprise. One felt that his training, whatever it had been, had prepared him to meet any situation which might confront him. He was as much at home in the bishop's study as in his own pueblo, and he was never too much at home anywhere. Father Latour felt he had gone a good way toward gaining his guide's friendship, though he did not know how. The truth was, Jacinto liked the bishop's way of meeting people, thought he had the right tone with Padre Gallegos, the right tone with Padre Jesus, and that he had good manners with the Indians. In his experience, white people, when they addressed Indians, always put on a false face. There were many kinds of false faces. Father Valance, for example, was kindly but too vehement. The bishop put on none at all. He stood straight and turned to the governor of Laguna, and his face underwent no change. Jacinto thought this remarkable. Coming up,
anti-Catholicism and nativism can be two different things, although at this time they were quite joined together. So nativism refers to an anti-immigrant disposition. Anti-Catholicism emerged as integral to American identity as a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant Republican.
Now this.
Support for this program comes from NordVPN, a provider of virtual private network services. NordVPN offers tools designed to encrypt internet traffic and route connections through remote servers, helping to enhance online privacy and reduce digital tracking. More information is available at purplecatholic.com/NordVPN. And by Expedia, an online travel service offering booking options for flights, hotels, rental cars, and vacation packages. Expedia provides tools to compare and book accommodations, transportation, and activities with a wide selection of options available. More information is available at purplecatholic.com/Expedia.
Don't forget, you can get early ad-free access to each episode of Death Comes for the Archbishop by becoming a paying subscriber at purplecatholic.com. Welcome back to the program. I'm Matthew Handley. We're going to take a step back from our story today and look at some history with Dr. John Pinheiro. He is a historian, author, and public intellectual whose works explore the intersection of religion, politics, and American identity. He currently serves as the director of research at the Acton Institute in Grand Rapids, Michigan, where he oversees scholarly research, publications, and international programming. He's the author most recently of Missionaries of Republicanism, A Religious History of the Mexican-American War. Dr. Pinheiro, it's good to talk to you. Thank you for joining me.
Oh, happy to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
I'm very excited to talk to you today, especially to talk a bit about your book a little bit later on. But to start, I'll preface that, I grew up in North Carolina, and a lot of my history growing up, American history, was focused on the Civil War with very little time spent on other aspects of American history. And as such, I am not particularly well-versed with the Mexican-American War. And I'm wondering, could you, starting a little bit at the beginning, could you give me and the listeners a bit of a quick primer on this conflict?
Sure. So I'll start off by saying that many Americans confuse the Mexican-American War with the Texas Revolution or the Spanish-American War. So the Mexican-American War, which is called the War of Northern Aggression in Mexico, the Mexican-American War started in 1846 and ended in 1848. And the result was that in the ensuing peace treaty, the United States annexed approximately 1/3 of the Republic of Mexico. And that included what is now California and also what was called New Mexico under Mexico. But that included the states of Nevada and Arizona and New Mexico and parts of Colorado and parts of Utah. So it was a very, very large area. That area was known as the Northern Mexican Frontier. And both New Spain, when Mexico was a Spanish colony, and also the Republic of Mexico, which had been around only 25 years at that point, and also the Republic of Mexico. They had a difficult time hanging on to that frontier. They had a difficult time, the Mexican government did, getting Mexicans to settle in the north. Spain had trouble getting Hispanic from Spain to settle there as well. And so Americans tended to look at this area, and at least those in the area, they traded with the United States. They were on American trade routes. They depended on the United States for revenue and tax money. And so in the war, the United States ostensibly was going to war on account of a Texas boundary dispute. But the president, James K. Polk, who was a Democrat, and that was the party of territorial expansion in the first half of the 19th century, James K. Polk, one of his major goals was to annex California. And if New Mexico came along with it, fine. There's a lot of different things that grew out of this war. Ulysses S. Grant blamed the Civil War on all the tensions over slavery and expansion that resulted from the Mexican-American War fallout. I wrote a whole book on anti-Catholicism during the war because this was a high point of nativism and anti-Catholicism in the country. And the Protestant United States was waging war on a Catholic country, which it claimed in part was in such dire shape because of its religion of Roman Catholicism. As it turns out, slavery didn't enter any of those territories, but that was also the fear of abolitionists, that this was just a war to spread slavery. Now, another thing that occurred in this war is Texas eventually received the boundaries it now has. So Texas claimed quite a bit of ground. And in fact, at the end of the war, Texas and New Mexico were ready to go to war to settle their boundary dispute, let alone Texas and Mexico. Texas had won its independence from Mexico in 1836, 10 years earlier than the Mexican-American War. So the Republic of Mexico was a little over 10 years at that time. And there had been a number of revolts in Mexico. And in previous revolts, the Americans living there who had been invited there by the Mexican government and offered land in order to civilize it, because the Mexican government did not see Indians as civilized and wanted white people, whether they were Protestant or Catholic, although ostensibly they required conversion to Catholicism to move there. But in 1836, things were different, and Stephen Austin and Sam Houston and the rest of them decided to side with those revolting against the government in Mexico City. And the tension always was that there were these centralizing forces in Mexico City who wanted to centralize and rule these northern frontier territories from afar. And that just wasn't practical, and it wasn't possible. And especially in California, which also fought 6 revolts during this time period we're talking about, California was virtually autonomous by the time it came into the United States. There's a great book by, his name is Weber, called The Northern Mexican Frontier, and this is just the classic academic study of the northern Mexican frontier. And what we find is that just because they're chafing at rule from Mexico City, of course, doesn't necessarily mean they want to be annexed by the United States. But there's a great complexity here in the mid-19th century in North America, and if we were to go farther south, into South America, we'd see something similar. That is, the nation of Gran Colombia, which was set up after the South American revolutions, once included Venezuela and Colombia and Panama and Ecuador, and it was breaking into thirds and fourths, finally with Panama shortly after the turn of the 20th century. So there's just a lot of making and unmaking of borders as Spain's empire was falling apart in the 19th century. And the dynamic, very populous United States conquered Mexico in this war. The war started in April of 1846. The Americans laid a defensive line across the northern Mexican frontier to separate it from the south. When Mexico did not sue for peace, then the United States invaded the heartland of Mexico beginning in February of 1847. And by September of 1847, they were standing in Mexico City. The U.S. Army occupied major Mexican cities. There were military governors in Mexico ruling these cities. And eventually, by 1848, the peace treaty, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, was signed, and that ended the war. And $15 million passed to Mexico to pay for California. No one really knows what happened to the money, but Polk's idea was that to show that this wasn't a war of conquest, they were going to pay for California. Andrew Jackson and others had tried to purchase Texas, purchase California, sent diplomats prior to this. It wasn't just Polk, but there had been other presidents working with Mexico. And sometimes the Mexican presidents were friendly, and sometimes they weren't. But the great difficulty for the Americans was that the Mexican presidency changed hands 14 times between the 1820s and the Mexican-American War, but none of those were by election. And so there was always this political instability. And one way to make the place even more politically unstable was to claim, of course, you were going to sell a big chunk of your own country to the country next door. And so that had led to an overthrow quite close to the war. And even during the war, General Santa Anna, who was infamous among Americans for his behavior at the Alamo and killing the prisoners there, Santa Anna blamed the Mexican generals themselves. He said, we have nobody to blame for the losses in this war other than ourselves because of our interminable infighting. And as the Americans were landing in Veracruz, the Mexican generals' armies were fighting each other for control in Mexico City. So in some ways, it's kind of the classic case of the divided land getting conquered.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like then peace came about, as you had mentioned, essentially after Americans had occupied most of Mexico. Am I understanding that correctly? Okay.
Yeah, so General Zachary Taylor was in the north, but it was Winfield Scott himself who was overseeing the army as general-in-chief, led an amphibious invasion in Veracruz, Mexico. After bombarding the town, civilians and all, the Americans came ashore and didn't really find much opposition. There was one major battle on the way inland, a few other battles, and then a series of major battles around Mexico City. So that the main fighting in the war really occurred in 1847. California and New Mexico fell pretty easily. In fact, the New Mexico governor went out of town on a horse, and that was it.
Mm. Let's switch and talk a little bit about your book now, Missionaries of Republicanism. Going through a little bit of it myself. You had mentioned, and just from your comments previously, you had mentioned nativism and anti-Catholicism as some of the almost justifying factors that were being spread around to engage in this war on the American side. Where did that originate from? Where did that spark from?
So the anti-Catholicism and nativism can be two different things, although at this time they were quite joined together. So nativism refers to an anti-immigrant disposition that just sort of hates immigrants in an unrealistic way, that doesn't realize the good that immigration can bring, and is also just kind of afraid of the immigrants, that they're going to change the character of your country rather than adapt to it. And so the character of the United States in the early 19th century could best be described as white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. And so what the book is about, what Missionaries of Republican is about, is how anti-Catholicism emerged as integral to American identity as a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant republic, and the role that the Mexican-American War played in that. So Americans, since the time of the Puritan settlers in the early 1600s, Americans had believed that Providence somehow was on their side, and evidence seemed to bear this out in terms of their economic dynamism and expansion and population growth, and winning their Revolutionary War against the greatest power in the world, and then winning Revolution Part 2 in the War of 1812 against that same power. And so by the 1840s, there was this clear sense that the Americans were expanding westward, and that was also under Providence. But by that time also, there was wide-scale immigration by German and especially Irish Catholics to the United States. And so there was some anti-immigrant sentiment, nativist sentiment against the Germans and the Irish, but there was also this old latent anti-Catholicism that held that Catholics could not be good citizens of a republic, because they actually owe their final allegiance in even a temporal way to the Pope in Rome. So that if the Pope was to ask them to overthrow the government, they would overthrow the government. And so you put those two things together. And what I do in the book is talk about the person of Lyman Beecher, because what happened was there was this universal, very peculiar American kind of anti-Catholicism that most Americans had just thought had relegated, I say, to an evangelical subculture. But Lyman Beecher, from the famous Beecher family, put this together in a way that proved to be the most important means for understanding the war, but also understanding what it meant to be American. And pretty much every bit of rhetoric about the war, whether it was anti-war, pro-war, whether it was in favor of annexing all of Mexico or some of Mexico, whether it was abolitionists who said this is terrible, it's going to be a slave war, or there were abolitionists who said this is terrible, it's going to expand slavery, but at least we'll be able to vanquish a Catholic country from the continent. No matter who you look at, this anti-Catholic rhetoric was the primary tool. The label anti-Catholic, I should mention a bit about that, because it's not I wouldn't define it as anti-Catholic simply to disagree doctrinally with Roman Catholic theology or ecclesiology or eschatology. Protestants try to convert Catholics. Catholics try to convert Protestants. I don't think that's necessarily anti-Protestantism. In the best sense, we espouse our own religion because we take truth claims seriously, right? So, but the label, as I use it in the book, applies to those anti-Catholic, to those who maintained at the time that Catholics were not Christians at all. They identified the Pope with the Antichrist of the Book of Revelation. They propagated false and hateful stories about Catholics, what the historian Richard Hofstadter called the pornography of the Puritan, and the war gave them a lot of these sort of stories as well. But the most important thing is, and the thing that probably sounds most outlandish to us nowadays, is that they believed the Jesuits were leading an immigrant Catholic army into the West as part of a takeover of the Western United States orchestrated by the Pope. This is what Lyman Beecher said was the case. It's what Samuel F. B. Morse, who was also a popular proponent of this anti-Catholic nativism, also said was the case. And the end game was that the papacy would destroy republicanism at its source because Catholicism was inimical or antithetical to Republican government. And I use Republican here not as our modern political party, but right. In terms of representative government. We usually just say democracy, but as an historian, that's more difficult for me to use that in describing a republic. So the vast majority who believed this, or at least used this rhetoric, were evangelical Protestants. What Lyman Beecher said was, if you're going to save the United States, you're going to have to go into the West as Protestant missionaries, Protestant teachers, Bible societies, you name it, and you're going to have to take the West. Otherwise, the Catholics are going to flood the place and get there first. And maybe even the Pope, because he's having troubles in Rome, is going to move to the Mississippi River Valley and set up shop there. And so this was used to raise all kinds of money for the American Tract Society, the American Bible Society at the time. A number of different groups. There was even a Native American Party, it was called, that had 6 members of Congress and controlled some state houses, including Pennsylvania, won the mayoralty of New York, and they joined this, what I would say, this older, religiously based anti-Catholic rhetoric with the nativist rhetoric, and this is what people cut their teeth on heading up to the Mexican-American War.
So with the story, like you had mentioned, that the bishops were running some sort of immigration invasion that you talked about with one of Beecher's claims. Did they have anything that they attempted to base it on evidence, or was it just totally made up out of whole cloth?
So there's a couple things. So one was that there were Catholic schools being built in the United States. There were convents, there were schools. Protestants, leading government officials in places like Washington, elites in places like Boston were sending their children to these schools. And so I one would be tempted to think that in the American tradition, we might say, oh, it's an example of religious liberty. This is something to be celebrated. But they didn't see it that way. They saw it as a takeover and an overturning. And so what people like Beecher warned is that Americans were complacent and they were going to be taken over. They were going to be taken over. The Jesuits had trained in Europe specifically to do this. So you imagine the Jesuits are the generals and the rank and file. Beecher said, hey, they might be nice people, but when they go into the confessional or they go into mass and they're going to get their marching orders and they're going to come out and there's going to be trouble. So that was one thing, just the existence of those schools. And so there was a riot in 1836 in Charlestown, Massachusetts, where a convent and school run by the Ursuline order, which had come from Ireland, was burnt down to the ground. And then there were a very deadly set of riots in 1844, which in Philadelphia, which burnt several churches and Irish Catholic homes and neighborhoods and schools in the city of Philadelphia. Two separate sets of riots, which included even the Pennsylvania militia having to come out with artillery to quell the riot. And then there were stories like the Maria Monk book about a nun who had escaped from a convent and told stories of all these terrible things that had happened in the convent. And it turns out this had actually been written by a male pastor. But that was quite popular, and that was kind of the litmus test. If you can imagine conspiracy theories now, you usually get to the point where you get the litmus test, where if you don't believe X, then you don't really understand what's going on. If you didn't accept the veracity of Maria Monk, then you were probably just unaware and too complacent. The last thing I'll say is Pope Gregory in the 1830s issued an encyclical called Morari Vos, which condemned religious liberty, liberalism, and a number of the kind of liberties that Americans admire. So if you wanted some backing from the Pope himself for your position that Catholics hated liberty and religious liberty and Republican government, then you sort of had Morari Vos on your side. And there's a lot of different ways to interpret that, and I do talk about that in the book. But all these things just kind of come together, and you can cherry pick like proof texting scripture. And this is one of the things that was occurring as well.
Well, and I might want to come back to that here in a second, but I do want to ask this. With Beecher and others, how do they square anti-Catholicism and essentially calling Catholics fundamentally un-American with the rights that are listed in the First Amendment? How do they square that circle?
Well, so that's an interesting question. I think it's the right question to ask. And I guess the metaphor I use in the book is to say, look, let's say you have types who are given to criminality. Would you rather have them locked up or not? Or would you just let them walk around praying and hoping that they're not going to engage in crimes, even though eventually they will? So in other words, it was a question of good order and prudence. And the thinking was that Catholics were a danger to the very liberties you're talking about in the First Amendment. That if Catholics took over, they would end religious liberty. They would end civil liberty. And civil and religious liberty, people like Beecher said, are the main pillars of what it means to be an American. And so that keeping the Catholics out was actually preserving liberty. That was their argument. There were other suspect groups. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Mormons, were another suspect group in the 1830s as well, in the 1840s. And they were run out of the country. In fact, they settled in what was then part of Mexico, in Utah, and ended up fighting in the Mexican-American War, assuming that they would get independence in Utah, which they eventually did. But the Mormon battalion, so far as I know, remains the only U.S. Army battalion ever organized strictly along religious lines, and that was in the Mexican-American War. But there never was a Catholic extermination order, but there was a Mormon extermination order. And the other thing I guess that always is worth noting, everything I'm describing, these are extremes in American society, and we don't want to forget that Catholics could own property, they could own businesses, they could own guns, and these are three things that African Americans, particularly those enslaved, could not do.
Right.
So we want to keep a whole whole understanding of what people thought about liberty or didn't think about liberty in this time period as well, just to make sure we maintain that perspective.
Let's talk about Mirare Vos by Gregory the 16th. You just mentioned that, talking about liberalism and religious indifferentism, I think is what it would really translate to well in English. It looks like with Gregory here, he's quoting from Trent and talking about the requirement for people to preach the gospel. Is it the duty to keep people from living in error? Was that the motivation for this particular encyclical, and for saying, well, with religious liberty, you're allowing people to live in error?
Yes. So the question had been, and I addressed this in an essay and some speeches, lectures that I give for Acton Institute on Thomas Jefferson. The question is, it's in another book I wrote called The American Experiment in Ordered Liberty, where I talk about religious liberty and Thomas Jefferson. And the question always is, are people like Jefferson, are they in favor of religious indifferentism, which is a term Gregory uses and other popes have used, or religious liberty? And is religious liberty the same as religious indifferentism? Now, what I see in the unfolding of history is that the United States and our history played a role in the development of Catholic doctrine by giving an example of the blessings of religious liberty. So much so that Cardinal Gibbon was writing the Pope in the late 19th century, saying the things you are condemning actually aren't happening here. And beyond that, religious liberty has led to a flourishing of Catholicism here, and it's actually a good thing. And this seems to be, if you look at the documents of Vatican II, certainly this is the case by the 1960s. There's a sense, and you get it when you go into any country now that you go into that has an official church, and the official church is almost always empty on Sundays. This was even the case in the 19th century. However, I mean, it was almost. People like to talk about how great it was in Austria in the 19th century for Catholics. But you have to remember, these are the areas, especially going into the 18th century, that banned the Jesuit order and that pushed around the clergy, pushed around the bishops, and tried to oversee the bishops. So if the Pope in Rome was to write some kind of, orders to bishops, let's say, and joining bishops to do something, the American bishops would do it. But if your Catholic king or queen or emperor in Europe said you can't do it, you couldn't do it, even if you're a bishop in an ostensibly Catholic country. So it's more complicated, I think, than Gregory thought.
Right.
And the church, there's this development in that sense. And I think, the example of religious liberty not leading to nuns on the scaffold, like in the French Revolution, that experience had to take place. So Gregory, he says that like a flock of errors can't compensate for publishing a few books. So in other words, freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, these things are overrated. You're worshiping liberty. You're not worshiping God. And he quotes Augustine of Hippo, who said that the death of the soul is worse than freedom, than the freedom of error. So you have to realize what's the most important. So this is Gregory's concern here. And what he's looking at is the events of the 1830s, yet another French Revolution. Whenever the church binds itself to temporal powers, and those temporal powers get overthrown, the church gets overthrown too.
Right.
In my opinion, that's a call for religious liberty, not a call for no religious liberty. But when he talks about death and destruction, etc., this is firsthand. This is what he thinks liberalism is and what liberalism does. So he's critiquing its dangers and consequences, which seem very legitimate in Europe, but they don't really match up to the American experience at that point. And so the question was, so what? You're reading this and you're a native-born Protestant, already kind of afraid of Catholics. You just assume they're up to no good, but you know some and they seem nice. And then you read this, and then you read Beecher, and you just start putting this stuff together.
Sure, yeah. So you had mentioned Cardinal Gibbon, so I'm going to skip ahead a little bit in our timeline to 1899 with Leo XIII. And I've heard this come up in recent weeks, in part because of the name that our new pope has picked, Leo XIV. And one of the things that Leo XIII had written in 1899 was condemning what he called the heresy of Americanism. And you had mentioned that response from Cardinal Gibbons that, indeed some of those things are not happening in the way that he saw, that the Pope at the time thought that he was seeing him. When did Rome start to kind of adapt and change to realize that some of the things they were concerned about were not actually going on in the way they thought?
Well, so it bears stating that Gibbon was writing from a country that still had strong anti-Catholicism.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he's writing in the 1880s and after the Council of Baltimore, and he's writing in the 1880s, and this is the time period where the American bishops decided that every single parish in the country had to have a Catholic school, because the public schools, it's not that they were secular, they were Protestant.
Right.
And that's what some of the writing was over in the 1840s, by the way. So what I think the teaching really begins with Gibbons, who is telling Rome that we're still able to minister the gospel, we're still able to spread the gospel, we're balancing liberty in order. We're not promoting liberty without. That you can have liberty without license,
mm-hmm.
is what he says. You can have authority without despotism. But he built on earlier work from Orestes Brownson, who was a 19th century
mm-hmm.
American philosopher who went through a number of conversions and finally ended up Catholic. And so Brownson formulated the American approach even before Gibbon did. And it's really Brownson and Gibbon and eventually John Courtney Murray and others that you see in not only in the Catholic Catechism, but in Dignitatis Humanae, saying that religious freedom is actually a fundamental right as a creature of God. And here's what that means. And so what Brownson said was the religious mission of the United States isn't to establish a church by law, or to protect the church, or to put disabilities on some church. You maintain the freedom so that you can pursue the truth of things. And this was actually largely Jefferson's opinion, who was not an Orthodox Christian of any kind, but for him, religious freedom was also about the pursuit of truth.
Dr. Pinheiro and I will continue our conversation on American Catholicism in next week's episode. In our story, Bishop Latour will hear the legend of Fray Balthazar, one of the more despicable stories of his diocese. Stay tuned. I'm Matthew Handley, and Lord willing, I will talk to you then. Goodbye.
Special thanks to our broadcast partners. The Purple Catholic Literature Collection presents Death Comes for the Archbishop, narrated and presented by Matthew Handley. Copyright 2025 M.H. Media Ventures, LLC. All rights reserved. For more, visit purplecatholic.com.